Hello and welcome back, and we're going to be moving on after our introduction to due process in the United States Constitution to a case called the Slaughterhouse cases and some initial definitions. And here was the slide that I showed initially, the overview of all of these lectures. And we are right there on the second bullet, initial interpretation slaughterhouse cases. And then we're going to move on to 19th and 20th century and modern due process. So in the first lecture, we defined what due process is, and then we didn't really talk about how the court defines what is a fundamental right or not. We simply talked about how we got to the place where due process is in the Constitution in the 14th Amendment, limiting the power of the states. That was where Barron versus Baltimore was supposed to get us. And now we're going to go on to something more substantive about the initial interpretation given to due process in this case called the Slaughterhouse cases. Okay, Slaughterhouse cases are a group of cases that were all brought up to the Supreme Court at the same time. They involved the same issue and almost the same factual set of circumstances, and they were all consolidated by the Supreme Court into a single case, and they gave it a name. They were all involved slaughterhouses in New Orleans, so they called it the Slaughterhouse cases. The facts of this case are kind of interesting. So after the Civil War, there's still a military occupation of the South. The city of New Orleans had actually fallen quite early in the Civil War, and the military continued its occupation. And while the military occupation is going on, the 14th Amendment is ratified. Then after a bit of time, something akin to the bubonic plague breaks out in the city, and people realize it's because of these slaughterhouses, these privately owned slaughterhouses that are set up north of the city, and they're slaughtering animals, and then after they're done, they dump what's left of the carcasses into the Mississippi River, and these rotting carcasses float down the river to the ocean, they're polluting the water of the Mississippi, which at the time was the main source of water for the city of New Orleans. People are drinking this water and they're getting very sick. And so the state of Louisiana, which is under military occupation at the time, it shuts down these private slaughterhouses and it opens a state-regulated slaughterhouse, one that is owned by an individual or a company that received a bid from the state or submitted a bid to the state, was accepted, and the state sets the rates, and it requires all animals slaughtered within the city of New Orleans to be slaughtered at this state-run slaughterhouse. Now, was this an effort by the legislature to pay off some of their cronies? Absolutely. This was a dirty deal. This was an effort to shut some people down and make somebody else a lot of money. And so, of course, the owners of these private slaughterhouses that exist north of the city, they sue. They sue the state of Louisiana. The issue is whether closing the privately owned slaughterhouses constitutes involuntary servitude, violates the Privileges and Immunities Clause, denies equal protection, and deprives them of their property without due process of law. So basically, these slaughterhouse owners, they threw everything in. I mean, they kitchen sinked it. They threw every clause of the 14th Amendment and the 13th Amendment in to dispute and try and win this case against the state of New Orleans, get their property back. They still own their property. They just simply couldn't use it for its intended purpose. And they were basically put out of business. They could not practice their calling, their livelihood. Okay, so let's go down these one by one because this is such a complex case, and you'll notice I didn't ask you to brief it this week, but there's a rule for each one of the claims that they make. The court says, sorry, 13th Amendment out, this is out, this is not an involuntary servitude. Obviously, this was intended to, the 13th Amendment was intended to apply to slavery, and you're not being enslaved. Secondly, they basically say, we don't know what privileges and immunities are, but a right to practice your livelihood is not a privilege and an immunity under the 14th Amendment. And that's almost the last time the Supreme Court has really said much at all about the Privileges and Immunities Clause. And so much so that in this area, anyway, we think of it as dead in terms of civil rights, civil liberties. Equal protection, the court says it applies to freed slaves. There's some disagreement about whether they intended that to be true for all time, to limit the Equal Protection Clause only to freed slaves. It does appear that perhaps that could change in the future. It certainly did. This portion of the Slaughterhouse cases has been overturned. Equal protection now applies to all persons. That's actually what the amendment says. And then the court says due process means government neutrality. Now you remember from a previous lecture what government neutrality is. It's the requirement that all states act, they use their power to create social order through laws of general applicability, unless they can find some reason for acting non-neutrally related to public health, safety, welfare, and morals. So here's what the Supreme Court says. It says the use of the state's police power requires neutrality. Government has to act neutrally. And if they act non-neutrally, if government acts non-neutrally, there must be something to justify it that's based on public health, safety, welfare, and morals. The court says, yep, the bubonic plague it justifies this non-neutral action because this most assuredly was non-neutral. It deprived a certain class of people of the right to conduct their business, their chosen profession, and then created this state entity. It most certainly was non-neutral. The court bought the idea that the real reason for doing this was to help the public trust. To help the public safety and health and welfare. All right, so what are the implications of this decision? Well, first of all, privileges and immunities never comes back. We're left almost entirely with equal protection and due process. Secondly, the court eventually changes its speculation that equal protection only applied to freed slaves, and later the court extends it to apply to various classes of persons. And in terms of due process, we still don't know what it is. We don't have a definition. But we do know that taking property under these circumstances isn't a violation of due process. And that is the extent of what the court has to say about due process in this case. It doesn't give it a general definition. It limits its ruling to these specific circumstances. Okay, well, that's the end of the lecture on Slaughterhouse, and thank you very much for listening, and we'll move along.